Welcome. You're tuned in to the We Are All Artists podcast, a space where we talk about living life as a conscious creative. I'm your host, Adriana Douglas. Our intention is to support you throughout the process of discovering your inner artist and transforming from the inside out. Here in this space, we believe that the way out is through. On the other side is a world with more art, more beauty, and access to more of you. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with me today. And now let's begin. Today on the podcast, I welcome Anthea Bell. Anthea is a British-born embodiment coach, supporting those she works with toward profound mind-body connection and beyond to transformative self-knowing and self-empowerment. Her philosophy is this: nothing is separate. By optimizing mindset, neurological function, energetics, and physicality, we create profound change not only for the individual, but for the community and organizations that they belong to. Our bodies encode so much of what we haven't processed, haven't released, and continue to live with and through. They manifest our deeper vulnerabilities for as long as we neglect them. And yet, we also have the most incredible, hardwired capacity for healing. Mind and body naturally seek out equilibrium and integration. All that's needed are the right conditions, framework, and guiding hands. Anthea's passion is to provide this foundation, cultivating not only clients' holistic health, but their independent understanding, awareness, and agency. The agency to choose, ultimately, who they are and how they want to move through the world, to work toward their true potential, one step at a time. In today's episode, we talk all about what it's like to go from book learning to experiential learning and allowing for the real-time feedback to come through when you start implementing change in your life. Something else that was super interesting that we dive into is what the consequence could be of requiring perfection in your life and actually asking yourself the question, do you like the life that you're currently living? We dive into understanding your motives around daily behaviors, getting in touch with the sensations in your body, and what it's like to meet yourself when you are in periods of transformation and change. I feel so absolutely inspired after listening back to this episode, and I can't wait to hear how this episode also supports you in your integration and your daily life. Hi, Anthea. Welcome to the We Are All Artists podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's so nice to be here.
It's so nice to meet you. I'm so glad that we have finished the course that we were in, which brought us together. And I'm so excited to hear how your journey has been throughout and since finishing.
Yeah, it's been a real ride. I mean, I've loved it. I had such a strange knowing in about August of this year that I was going to make a podcast come winter this year. It was just so searingly clear. And then I was already listening to Kathy's meditations, and I was walking around LA and sort of soaking up the atmosphere there. And just one day, as I was going from one studio to another, I saw that she was doing a podcasting course, and I just had this, oh, okay, there we go. Well, that's my in. And since then, it's happened at the same time as quite a pivotal moment in my own development. And this thing around finding a voice and allowing that really to be quite visible, to be public in what you believe in, to be public in the things that fire you up. That's sort of the journey that I'm on right now. After a good few years of deep dive development, it's now really coming to the surface. And so, yeah, it's been the most amazing experience. And I've met so many of you amazing Americans and learned a lot about people's passions within this industry, because actually a lot of us it's been fascinating to see the spectrum. A lot of people are working within the holistic space, within the creative space. And these are the sorts of people that want to sit behind a screen or sit in a podcasting room and find out about other people's stories.
I love that. I love that you followed your intuition and that was so clear. And also, I completely resonate with the allowing your voice to be visible, like in public. I feel like I myself have been, the last few years, like a bit of a hermit in a way, going on this inner journey. And to finally start to see it present itself in the outer world and see it come to life and also allow others to experience it with you. I feel like it's so transformative because it's almost, in a way, there is some sort of manifestation or validation of all that needed to come together in order to get us here today.
Yeah, very much so. And I think what you are referencing almost is this difference, and both of these are really valid, this difference between book learning, let's say, and experiential learning. And there's so much that one has to do in this really beautiful generative process that you do behind the scenes. Like you were talking about the artist's way earlier, and I was
Yeah.
thinking about my experience with that. And that you're sitting down doing morning pages every morning, right?
Yep.
Every morning, every morning, every morning. And the idea is that eventually that will lead to your creative outpouring. But you're taking these tiny incremental steps within your daily. And I think that that's really key in terms of learning how to relate to yourself in a different, more nourishing, more self-caring way. And you can't only do that, because if you only do that, you stay relatively insular and you never allow experiences in your externals and people in your externals to begin to co-create with you. And so it has to be the both. And my experience was I had quite a lot of bravery in doing the inside job and doing that behind closed doors and making my life a lot about other people's growth. So I was comfortable being seen publicly for being a support structure for another person and championing other people's messages. And then there was this point where I was like, okay, well, I actually have to start backing myself as much as I back other people. And I have to start doing that in a way where more people can be reached by the things that I have been lucky enough to experience and learn over the journey. So I think both are really, really supportive. And this has given us all the platform to do both of those things.
I so agree. The book learning versus the experiential learning has been something that is huge. In end of 2020, I finished a master's and an MBA, and there were a lot of components that were experiential in that experience. But what I did notice was, I will always be a lifelong learner and lifelong searcher of more knowledge, if you will. But the pausing to go live out what you've learned and put it into practice has been, it's such a gift, but it comes with its own challenges, because you're like, how do I put all these words into practice, or how do I actually take the learnings into my life in real time? So I really resonate with that, because it's like, why are we doing all this work if we don't get to go live a joyful, abundant, full life with other people that we love and want to be around,
And I think there's something in how much edge it brings up to be doing more of that experiential thing, because the wonderful thing about book learning is that, and we talked about this a little bit, you and I, before we started recording, that you can completely cultivate a finished product before it then becomes visible. And so the fear that we all have of being seen in a particular way that we don't want is really softened. And that's how most exam systems are based. You study and study and study and study, you perfect whatever it is that you're focusing your energies on, and then you pass the exam. And then as far as everyone else is concerned, the only thing they've seen is the grade. They haven't seen all of the blood, sweat, and tears that have gone into it. And the terrifying thing about experiential learning is that quite often your blood, sweat, and tears are being exposed, like right there, live in the moment. And so all of our stuff comes up. And it's all the stuff that needs to be brought to the surface in order that we start to develop a more self-compassionate way of relating to ourselves. And it's part of that theme of trusting a little bit the people around you and a little bit the universe around you more than maybe you thought you could, that they can hold your flaws and they can hold your vulnerability and they can hold the fact that you're going to get it 50% this time, 60% the next time, 80% the third time. And, in 5 years' time, you'll be pretty slick at this. But in the period in between, it's scary and really useful, and very humbling. And that's what this whole experience of creating the podcast is also.
Completely agree. The sort of studying and performing for a grade, right? It's like this whole sort of, depending, I guess, on what school you went to or what school system or what sort of method you did growing up, but like this idea of like the performing and intaking, memorizing. I remember for me, a lot of tests was memorize, put it onto the test and like wipe your mind, after the test. And so what you were mentioning of us putting, like, for example, these podcasts into the world and allowing for the testing to happen in real time and be like, oh, maybe that topic didn't hit, or let me change the title of this podcast, or, let me see how I can connect with somebody better when I'm pitching for a guest interview. And so I love that you're bringing that up, because I feel like we're so conditioned to be like, I do this thing and then I get this grade, or I get this mark, or I get this exact feedback back that tells me exactly what I need to do to like take the next step. And we've sort of gone into a more ambiguous territory but also more clear by getting real-time feedback and allowing ourselves to revise along the way. And I think that's something that I learned so much from this course, was really about the clarity coming from taking action. You hear, I feel like sometimes we hear this stuff on the self-help, self-discovery, self-love, self-healing. We hear some of these like typical phrases. And so for me, the clarity comes from action is kind of one of those phrases that I understood. I kind of believed. Sometimes I would take action and feel no clarity, but something like the podcast, I really feel like there was no way not to get clarity. Like once things started happening. What has been your experience with that?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I've really had to be very patient with myself when it's not been perfect. So it's sort of learning a level of adaptability that I didn't know that I had in me before. And I'm just reflecting on what you're talking about generally, because that approach to life of having it perfect before it is visible, it's really, really pernicious. And in my experience, my literal lived experience, because that was a strategy that I applied, from my 300-person all girls North London school for that, 2 decades, right through university. I got a high first, right through my early careers. I applied that strategy again and again and again. And what, of course, it leads to is workaholism, of course, because the more things that you're presented with that are out of your control, the harder your mind, your body, your nervous system are going to work to desperately bring those things under your purview again. And if you're doing that, like I was a corporate fundraiser, so if you're doing that with a massively unrealistic financial target, as someone that loves people but doesn't so much love the hard sell, you just end up sort of butchering yourself with work. And I did that with my job, and I did that with how hard I tried at family relationships and how much effort I would put in, and I did that with how I looked after my body. And I did all of the right things from this place of it has to be perfect, it has to be perfect. And of course, the entire time you're in so much effort that you couldn't possibly have any freedom, any creativity, any real authentic clarity, because you're living your life according to should. You've decided that there are these moral rules about how you should live your life that you absolutely need to obey. Otherwise, your success will crumble, or your relationships will crumble, or whatever it is. Quite a lot of the time, we're not even particularly clear on the exact fear, but we just know that we have to survive in the exact way that we're doing it. And so I did that for a really long time. And it got me a load of things, a load of numbers after my name, and, all of that stuff. And I was utterly grey inside, and totally numb, and really, really unhappy. And I went through a period of time when I started to do the kind of work that you're describing, where I would get asked a lot about my story, because I had quite an impressive physical collapse. And that really forced me to reassess how I was approaching things. And I quit my job and took some time off, which no one was able to understand because it was so uncharacteristic of me, and moved cities and changed careers and did all the things. And while I was doing that, I did a lot of spiritual deep diving. And I would get asked about what had changed, because people wouldn't necessarily know the ins and the outs, because I'd also become extremely private, which is what you do when you're very controlled. You don't really let anyone in, because that would be releasing too much, which doesn't feel safe at the time. So I'd get asked about it. And, I used to say it wasn't that I didn't want to be here. It wasn't anything dramatic in the sense of, I never got to any stage like that. But if you'd really honestly asked me, do you want to be living your life? If you put it in those terms, would I have said yes? I don't think so. I don't think I really had any sense of what life could be, and how rich it could be, and how curious, and how beautiful, and how deeply, profoundly you could support other people, and just what it feels like to. So I'm an embodiment coach now. Mind and body are my terrain, a lot of the time one-on-one, and then sometimes in groups. And if you tried to describe to me then what it would feel like for a client to be able to leave their job, for example, having felt totally trapped inside it, and totally trapped to have to produce a certain amount of finance every month or every year, because otherwise all of the people that they believe are dependent on them would crumble. Seeing that growth is unimaginably abundant. And so, when Kathy talks about this idea that abundance is a feeling, in my book, she's totally correct. And I feel it in my body, in the life that I'm allowing to emerge now, and have been investing in the last 10 years. And it's what I see in you creating this resource for people, this amazing tool where your podcast is so oriented around how do we bring, you used the word earlier, like micro joy, those little moments of magic, how do we bring those into people's lives? And that's what the sound of somebody's voice in conversation can do. It's so powerful, so human connected.
I remember, to your point with what Kathy was saying about abundance, another note that I had that stuck out to me so much, which is kind of a little bit of what you're just mentioning. It was like, you can either control your life or be in love with your life. Like, but they can't, but like, you can't have both. It took me a while to unravel that one. So I think it's so important for those listening to ask themselves that question, kind of, that sounds like you're vocalizing, of really either, do you want to, or do you like the life that you're living? And I think that that's something that I asked myself as well after I finished this master's. Was like, I had the kind of a new set of credentials, if you will, and was like, what's changed? What's changed after you get this additional certification or additional knowledge, as we were talking about in the beginning, like performing, got the degree, got the thing, like, and then sort of like crickets, like what's next? What's going to actually fill that void? If I don't, am not completely in love with this life that I've created, how can I create a different one? And then also kind of coming full circle with something you were talking about a few minutes ago was the kind of the strategy from the old way of being doesn't work for the new reality you're creating, and how it's been such a journey for me, and I'm sure for you too, like how to understand that there's like a new strategy required for this new embodiment versus this old ways. And obviously, as we are all human, like old patterns and habits come up, like, and we deal with them like head on as they come up. But as a general statement, like how do we walk ourselves compassionately into the new reality that we're creating, that we want to live and are excited to live?
It's such a beautiful question. What you had me thinking was that this previous way of living that we were describing, if you were given real freedom of choice right from your earliest years, and someone said, okay, well, here's the model of what this next 10 years will look like with this attitude, would you readily adopt it? Probably not. And so it isn't often until we have a fracture, let's say, something that really breaks the mold of our current existence, that we give ourselves permission to even ask the question. So a lot of the people that I'm working with day to day, they haven't even asked the question, does this work for me? But what they have identified is that they're in chronic back pain, or they're in chronic anxiety, or they can't get on a plane. They're identifying the real heightened fear. And that phrase that you gave earlier, I really live by the principle that we have two choices, fear or love. And it's something that Marianne Williamson, said so beautifully in Return to Love. And actually, Marianne, that book was one of the first ones that I was given after my sort of, my equivalent of a fracture. And although I didn't believe in God in any Christian way, I really, really understood. I had a felt sense of understanding of what she was talking about, that there was this place where it was possible to start making decisions on the basis of love. And so in answer to the question, sort of how does one begin to do that practically? I think the thing that's really important to start to tune into is, as an individual, what are the experiences, what are the moments, what are the elements of lifestyle that are genuinely supportive for me at this moment in my life? Because it's usually applying generalized rules or generalized aspirations to ourselves as unique people that doesn't work. And a lot of the time when I see that happening, it's because people are wanting to make themselves into a better version than they currently think themselves to be. So let's say I have to start eating a certain way because I want to be the sort of woman that looks like this and gets this kind of partner, etc., etc. And we all do that in different areas where we have greater levels of vulnerability, fundamentally. And so the question that's actually much more pertinent is, me as me, what lights me up? And so clearly for you, creating a podcast lights you up, right? And there'll be other things, working in a secure job that gives you a certain sense of safety in your financial wherewithal, probably quite important. So there'll be elements of structure that are really beneficial. The problem is when the structure becomes so tight that it becomes a form of control that doesn't let anything else in. And the way that I navigate that is I go back to the practices that I have within my own repertoire and within my coaching repertoire that are fundamentally quite grounding and that allow me to clear a lot of the superficial frontal lobe thinking that gets in the way of deeper aligned intuition. And that's not to say that I don't do my tax return and, I don't do the grocery shopping and prep food and all of those things. But what it is saying is that that's kind of a separate part of my brain, and it's got a separate motivation. Let's say that's the, broadly speaking, self-care practical motivation. That's a separate energy, let's say energy system, even from the part of me that connects to the heart, the part of me that connects to other human beings, the part of me that connects to my expansive spirit, soul, creative vision. And so I set aside time to do both of those things. But my gateway is, well, I'll come back to a somatic practice, or I'll come back to a meditation, or like in the artist way, I'll journal. I'll just free journal. I mean, I send gratitude lists to one of my best mates every morning just by WhatsApp. And even that is enough to break the chain of habitual thinking and to get me into. So when I appreciate, I'm also then beginning to fire up my neurons to think about the things that I also love and desire and want to begin to welcome into my life. And so it's a very linked practice to manifestation, appreciation. They go really well hand in hand.
I think something that was coming up for me as you were sharing that was about the structure and the control, and kind of structure is a great thing and it's a wonderful thing. And then also there is a spectrum where like it can turn into this control mechanism. And something that happened to me a few months ago was I, for the last few years, had been tracking my food, my macros, because for me it was really important to learn nutrition in a bigger way. And also just I always have loved health and wellness. And so that was something that I enjoyed and loved doing and thought was great, and also just helped me stay on track. But what I noticed a few months ago was my creativity was sort of stalled a little bit, and I couldn't kind of figure out why. And it dawned on me one day that that level and that mechanism of tracking was like a control function, where I was so able to control, my intake, right? What I was eating, how much of it, to the gram, and it was killing my creativity. I couldn't do it anymore. I was like, this structure has now become like a prison. And so I went, and I'm now on this road of more intuitive eating. But I share that to say, like, that's a practical example of a day-to-day of something that was really like, I was clinging to the structure, and I was clinging to that control of like, I get to decide what, comes in my body and out, and what I'm doing with my food. But the minute I allowed myself to just make a wonderful recipe without counting anything that was like really nourishing for the body and soul, my creativity was like, oh, it was like a big exhale. It was like, let's go do something and then flow again. But it's just such a, I feel like that's a practical sort of application of, not necessarily blowing up all the structures in your life, but like noticing these places where you think it's fine, or like you don't, you're like, oh no, that's fine. That's just the way I have my structure for my diet. But like, it can really impact you.
Yeah, it's so huge. It's such a beautiful example to bring up because it's also so common. And especially, when I was in California this summer, I had a real contrast of cultures because I came from a quite sleepy part of England. I wasn't living in London at the time, I was living in Bristol. I went from there where no one dresses in nice clothing. And no one gives a toffee about what they look like, and everyone eats cake at 11 o'clock in the morning. It's that kind of, imagine a quaint old country place in England, and that's, you've got it.
Yeah.
So I went from there to Costa Rica, which is Latin and spicy and
Yes.
and fiery and sensual. And then I went from there straight to LA. And obviously I landed in LA, and LA was just roads, just wide roads. No one walked anywhere, which was ironic because I was staying in it was vast. And I was staying in Santa Monica right by the water. And so being the British person that I was, I would go and jump in the sea at 6 a.m. because that's just sort of my jam. But it was really a very pressurized artificial environment that I also loved. I love LA. But I did notice that edge. And I think what you're talking about is the edge point. So we get to think a little bit about motive. Is the motive that I had initially still the motive that's driving me? It's a really important one. because we can find ourselves in the same place from two very different emotional intentions.
Yes.
Yeah. That's maybe a podcast in and of itself.
I know, I'm like, pause there. I'm like, the motive behind the decision, the motive behind the structure, the motive behind the change, the intention.
It's that, and it's like the fear or love thing. And, am I doing this from a place of fear that if I stop doing this, something bad will happen? Because that's kind of where it can get to. Control is a really good strategy. It's not even really a physical thing. It's an approach that gives you something. And what it gives you is a feeling of safety in the world. Like if we go right back to the nervous system, it's the nervous system's hardwiring to establish safety in contexts where it doesn't feel safe. So quite a few of my clients come to me around body stuff, around food stuff, and what's the likelihood that they're going to get a flare up in whatever behavior it is on a series of weeks where they're having intense family trouble, or one of their kids is having difficulties at school, or whatever it might be. And so I think it's also so beautiful, and I just really want to honor the fact that you noticed the point at which it was beginning to cross over, because actually that is the hardest thing. And if you don't notice, what happens is it becomes so ingrained that then the fear of letting it go really outgrows the behavior, and it becomes a driver in and of itself. And then it's very difficult to step back without some kind of intervention from an external source. And that's where things then get into addictive behaviors. And although we talk about food and dieting as though it's a light, breezy topic, I can promise you addiction is where it goes. It's no different from any other behavior in that respect. You get just the same addictive kick from restriction as you do from drinking. It's a different tone, but it's the same stuff that's happening. Which is why it's so hard to come back from.
That's so interesting, because it really can either support you, these sort of structures or rules really support you, or completely take you out of flow and take you out of center or equilibrium. So I'm glad you named that, because it's that growth edge, or that edge, and the self-awareness. First of all, the self-awareness is key, but second of all, going to that edge and then knowing where it is. I think sometimes that can be the hardest part, is what you're saying. It's like knowing the edge, and also not, I would say, not going past the edge, but
yeah, you use the word equilibrium, and that's really beautiful, because what happens is you lose your sense of priorities the more extreme the behavior becomes, or the more required the behavior becomes. It dominates everything else. It becomes impossible to live a normal, balanced life. And so, of course, no creativity can happen there, because you're in a fear response. You just don't know it. Just the other danger around addictions is that their denial of it is sort of inbuilt in the mechanism. That's again why the noticing is really critical, because once you're too far down the line, you won't be able to see that what you're doing is a problem, because it becomes something that feels self-preserving when in fact it's self-destructive. It's a whole world of really fascinating study. I've digressed us slightly, but
but I'm thinking about the self-preservation piece, and just knowing for those listening that all of these functions played such an important role in protecting us, as we have gone through the world throughout our whole life. So it's like just that compassion piece that we were naming before, and also understanding that they're there because they served a function, or are still serving a function, right? And understanding that function with the support of another person, like, once you get into some of these like bigger patterns or deeper patterns, it's so helpful to have a support system to help you unravel them, because it can feel quite overwhelming when you start to see the intricacies and how all these things are working together or against each other. So I'm glad you brought it up, and how much space these take up in the mind and the body. So maybe we could go into that a little bit with the mind body, the space that that these thoughts or that these behaviors or that they're taking up in various places in your mind and body.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful topic. I think just in reference to what you're talking about in terms of support, because it leads on really beautifully, it is really critical. And in my experience, there's a couple of reasons why. The first reason is that I need to be able to see that there's an alternative, one that's actually compelling, not one that represents a life that I really wouldn't want to live, but one that represents a life where someone has experience of what I've gone through, whether it's as an experiencer or as a practitioner or both. And they can show me just by virtue of their being and their being in a place that is centered and their being in a place of love and compassion. They show me that there's an alternative, that there's another way of living. That's really key. All of us need models. It's like we do when we're at school, you know, we look up to the girls in sixth form and, you know, it's actually quite fundamental. It's what we do with our parents. It's why it can be so devastating when you realize that they're human beings with horrible flaws and wonderful traits at the same time.
Yeah.
But I think beyond that, there's also something, not just in the expertise of your practitioner, but in them giving you permission, not only to change, but also to let go of the self-blame of where you find yourself to be. Because 95% of the people that I work with, I would say, are to some degree blaming themselves for the situation that they find themselves in. Whether they come to me to do body work because they're in chronic pain, or whether they come to me because they're desperately unhappy and they want to learn some embodiment strategies or some mental strategies to begin to find peacefulness and to begin to find center. Almost always they have a story that they're bad. Like almost always, it's almost a story as old as time. I am bad. It's my fault. I'm not enough. I'm way too much. I am to blame for X, Y, Z. If I was better, then I mean the list goes on. And you know, certainly in talking about headspace, those beliefs go hand in hand with all of the behaviors that we don't like that we do. And the frustrating thing is that those beliefs are actually oftentimes underneath the surface driving those behaviors. Because if you live in a context in your mind where you're self-punishing almost unconsciously all the time, you have to find a way of making life feel palatable. And so you have to control, or you have to eat, or you have to drink, or you have to have frightfully inappropriate lovers, whatever it might be, that is your way of numbing the pain. And I say pain, and it sounds like quite a dramatic word, but ongoing, subtle self-criticism is very painful. And it lives in people a lot of the time, not just in their minds, but it absolutely lodges in their tissues. So if you want a really simple example of that, I've done quite a lot of work on low back pain, which, as pretty much every study will confirm, is one of the biggest physical epidemics that we're currently experiencing. And I know what industry you're in. And if we think about the medical insurance industry spends enormous amounts of money trying to solve this problem. Now, this problem is definitely a physiological problem, so I'm not disputing that. And what the biggest, most applauded studies have shown is that the body experiences two types of pain. It experiences pain that is externally or internally physiologically prompted, slip disc, displaced vertebra, trapped nerve running right through your piriformis muscle. So every time you fold at your hip, you experience tingly sensations all the way down your leg, which are a nightmare to live with. So you have that kind of pain. Now, the body cellularly regenerates. It can fully rebuild itself at peak rebuilding phase, fully rebuild itself within about 7 years. So we know that the body is hardwired for healing. They say in terms of soft tissue, your average, if the head is working well, it's going to be about 6 months. So if I have a client coming to me and they say, well, I have chronic back pain, I've had it for 10 years, I can't sit down, I can't get in the car, Lying in bed is really uncomfortable. I have to be on my side, etc. And they'll say, I want to give you my scans. I want to show you the disc. Show you the disc that's protruding backwards and out to the right. Because this is my problem, this disc. They'll wave this at me. And if I say to them, well, when was the rupture? And they'll say, oh, it's about 15 years ago. Ah, okay. It's really interesting. So 15 years ago, there was an insult to the body. Now we know that if a disc bulges, let's say, that some of the liquid will over the course of time be redistributed within the body. So the likelihood is that that degree of bulge won't still be the case later on down the way. Now, there will be other physical readjustments, a little bit like Tetris, that are taking place. And again, I don't want to diminish the fact that there is physiology involved. But what we also know happens is that the body and the brain and the body and the brain are doing this all the time, up and down and up and down. The mechanism of feedback goes. And so my body can send a signal to my brain that says there is danger somewhere near my lower back, because I'm back in an environment where previously, once upon a time, I had danger. I had a physical negative response. And it was strong enough that I'm now telling you we're back in this context. So I'm going to send a signal to the brain. And the brain is then going to send a cortisolic signal right back to the spine that tells it, oh, yes, okay, be in fear, be in a physiological state of fear, come right into your sympathetic nervous system. And what they've shown is that the lower spine, particularly, there's a very close relationship between our emotional brain, let's say, and the lower spine. And you've got more proprioceptive fibers in your lumbar spine and on the skin of your feet, in the soles of those feet, than almost anywhere else in your body, which means it's a mechanism that is constantly gathering data about the outside world. Yeah. Now, if you combine that with the fact that a lot of us spend a lot of time ignoring the back of our body, very rarely do you go for some kind of, aside from a massage, very rarely do you go for some kind of styling for the back body.
So true.
No, people are looking at your face the whole time. They're looking at your front body. So we're a bit numb about that area. I mean, in a sense, you could create a symbol there about being a bit numb about what's behind us, the past.
Mm-hmm.
But we're a bit numb about that because it's much easier to live forward motion in our adrenal system. But what happens with pain that lasts for sort of a year, 2 years plus, which is broadly speaking when they start to consider it chronic, is that the proprioceptive fibers that are receiving data and interpreting the data and sending a signal back up to the brain that tells the brain what that exterior is, that their ability to distinguish between different sensations becomes very, very blurred. So heat will be experienced as pain, or a rough texture will be experienced as pain, or a very small movement will be experienced as pain. And the problem is that we have such a low level of physiological understanding of even that. We're not taught this stuff at school or at university or even by our doctors, because I have a lot of doctor clients, I have a lot of psychotherapist clients. We're taught certain things that are very useful for the practice, but not necessarily for the practice of living. And so because people don't know this, then they believe the signal. Oh, I'm fearful that there's danger here. Okay, well, I'm going to believe that. And I'm now going to start to live my life according to that belief. Which brings us right back full circle to what we were talking about before, which is that we start to restrict, like you were saying about the micros and the macros. Well, your creativity is then massively restricted, or your social life is massively restricted because you can only go out to 3 restaurants in your local city. And we're saying with the body, people stop driving and they stop walking and they stop playing tennis. They stop seeing people because they get themselves into such a pickle where life feels so hard. And that really is what got me deeply exploring the mentality that was part of this puzzle, and that really started to send me down this route of, well, what can we do about it? How can we help people to come back from this? Because I was seeing that so often, because I started out as a Pilates practitioner, and so often people are sent to Pilates because they're in pain that they don't understand. And all that really happens is the physio will say, go and do Pilates to strengthen your core. And that's all they'll say. And what their client, this poor, unsuspecting client, doesn't realize is that they're going to start to actually have to face themselves as they re-educate how to move their body. They're also going to have to come into contact with their content and with the words that they use. There's a lot of support for the fact that in terms of neurolinguistics, if I say pain often enough, I'm going to start feeling what that feels like. And if I change that word to sensation, or even discomfort is softer than pain, it's much easier to be able to take it in a neutral way. It's like if I were to ask you to write a PhD versus just say to you, we'll do your morning pages for a year. You'll have the same amount of content at the end of it. Probably going to be even more beautiful if it's free journaling.
Right. So it sounds like, in a way, we don't want to experience pain. We as humans, like, pain, no, don't want it. So we avoid it, right? But we already are in pain unconsciously. And we just are living our life according to or in avoidance of it. And so, like what you were saying, coming into contact with the content is like just so transformative in and of itself, because the content is what we tell ourselves every day, how we're living, how we're designing our life according to the pain until we visit it or sit with it, or the sensations, right? So I love that you brought that up about the content of the body, because I think as we live very much from the neck up and are very mental, and especially in many of our day jobs, just the amount of thinking, the amount of output that we have to put in there, it even gives more sort of validation to the avoidance, because you're like, oh, I have to work. I get to avoid it because I have to work, or, insert whatever other behavior. But generally speaking, I feel like we're a culture where work is very rewarded. Like that's a part of the artist's way, a huge part of one of the chapters of like this like badge of honor, like I have to work, and so then you don't then have to question any of the other pieces of the puzzle. But like what you were, you shared a little bit about your story and your example, and I share, bits and pieces of my story as the podcast goes on. And it's like once like one domino falls, it's like kind of like there's no turning back. At least for me, there was no turning back. It was like I can't go back to that old way. It hurts too much, but I'm scared about going forward. So you're kind of, in some ways, it feels a little bit, at least for me, like a limbo in the beginning, until you've sort of, I don't know, reached a certain point where you're like, okay, I know this work is worth it. And even if I have 90 seconds of an uncomfortable feeling, I'm better on the other side. Like there's definitely this dance between old and new, between old behavior and new, or between, back pain and then feeling better, right?
100%. 100%. You use the word limbo, and the word that pops into my mind as you were using it is the word liminal. In art history, which was my first love, and it's what I did for a good long time. One of the areas that I specialized in was illuminated manuscripts, like 12th century, 13th century. Some of them are even 7th century, and a lot of them have borders. So they're sacred texts, right? They're Christian or they're Islamic, and they're sacred. And so you've got the physical edge of the page, and the physical edges of the page, depending on the value of the book, were gilded with gold. And then inside you've got the scripture, and the scripture will often be decorated with ornate illuminations. It's why they're called illuminated manuscripts. But there's always a border. And the border is often called the liminal space, and they use this phrase in energetic work, and in practitioners of magic, they talk about the liminal. And it's essentially what we, in modern terms, consider to be transitionary periods, or this space of the corridor. But in ancient folklore, ancient mythology, the liminal space actually had a really important function. It was protective of the sacred content inside. And I think what we can lean to often, if we go back even to that idea of control, is it feels very destabilizing to let go of an old vision, even if we know that it's not aligned. And it feels very, very scary to be moving towards an ill-defined vision. And so this liminal space where we're going out and gathering data and coming back and integrating and going out and gathering more and coming back, out and in and out and in and out and in, until we can really, truly, safely give ourselves fully to the vision of this new thing. That liminal space is so important. And I sometimes feel as though we rush it a little bit. You know, like we're so keen to get to the next thing. But if you were ready for the next thing, you'd have it right now. So you're not ready for whatever reason. Either there's stuff in the way, or you haven't met the person yet. You haven't got all of the support that you're gonna need, all of the foundations that you're gonna need. You know, you were talking to me a little bit about how your podcast is growing, and it's like that is all really gorgeous generative stuff. We don't put someone in kindergarten and then expect them to go and do their graduation at uni. They have years, and we respect that educationally, but somehow we don't respect it when we become adults, where we're meant to secure our job and get married and have little ones all by the age of 30. I don't know anyone that's been able to do that and now has a truly, truly fulfilling, successful life that looks exactly as it did at 30. They've all evolved.
I love that you mentioned the liminal space and what it translates to in terms of transitionary periods, because I definitely think I had the idea, and that's why I was laughing as you were saying it, is that transitionary periods had, like, they were really finite. Like, oh, a transitionary period is just a few months. It's just, hey, even a few days. But for me, there have been some transitions that are multiple years. Like, I thought the liminal space was just like you drop in and you drop out. But like, actually, sometimes the transition period is an actual chapter. I think I had this illusion that it was like chapter 1, chapter 2, and the transitionary period was like really short in between. But it's actually like the transition period's actually like a chapter. Like, to not discredit it, it gets its own chapter that gets to be written about.
It's that permission thing again. What's it like to really have a sabbatical from the way that you were living before? I mean, God, what is that like? How much grace is there in saying yes to receiving that? And trusting that you'll probably learn more in the freedom, the terrifying freedom of that, than you'd learn if you stayed tied to your desk or tied to your husband or whatever it might be. It's I go back to that word generative again. It's very generative and exciting and and terrifying. And it's even more the reason why we want to start attracting, you know, this is something for people to bear in mind, that they, you know, they say that a lot of who you are and what you feel and how you live is curated by the people that you spend your time with. And so if we were thinking about support structures, again, we could say that having a team of practitioners, I have more than one, like I have a little team. And I follow that Brené Brown principle that you have maximum like 5 people. Your 5 people are your judges. They're the people that you go to for counsel, and they're allowed to have an opinion. And I love that she's so decisive about this. She's like, if you're not on my list, you're not having an opinion about my life. You can have it. I'm just not going to listen. And I think when people are approaching that, because the liminal thing starts almost just as an inkling of like, oh God, I'm going to have to start changing now, aren't I? Oh God, I don't want this anymore. I want something different. And you want to start just gathering those people, just noticing, oh, I'm really vibing with this person over here, and oh, this practitioner, there's something in my heart that really opens at the sound of what she does. You know, you just start gathering those people, and they help you to slowly emerge as the person that you now are. This is maybe the last thing I'll say on this, but this idea that we cellularly regenerate in 7-year cycles. You know, they talk about the 7-year itch in relationships and in jobs. Well, we know that the body and the mind are not distinct in the way that we previously thought that they were. So we know that my biology is constantly influencing my thinking. You know, they talk about the gut as the second brain, and that's very, very truthful. If it's dysregulated, it can create anxiety and depression, and you will believe these things. You will very much feel them emotionally speaking. And so there is something quite liberating about saying to yourself, well, the me that was 7 years ago lived this way and chose these things. We have far more agency than we think that we do. And now, 7 years later, my body is probably very little the body that I had then. And so what would it be like to follow the example of nature and give myself the opportunity to reinvent in a way that is now more aligned to the cellular structure that I have? And that takes probably the next 3-4 years. And then you hit your stride.
I love that about the reinvention with the cellular structure that we have now. Because I think very much, even though we say we play the comparison game outward of comparing ourselves to those around us, like what you were just mentioning with the reinvention, I'm thinking like I could find myself comparing back to me 7 years ago, being like, oh, is it better or worse? Or am I improved here? And it becomes these like, it can become this dance of like metrics and of like, again, like the metrics that don't matter. So I like that you mentioned that about reinventing with the cellular structure, right? Because that is so different of a narrative, even to talk about inside versus, because that's more about the being than all the accomplishments. So we go into that, changing your state and the abundance and the things that you want to tap into versus, to me, yeah, more of those externally validated markers.
Which we know don't make you happy anyway. I mean, the happiness comes from the being. It comes in community and it comes from within the being.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a state of mind, and in some respects, it's a decision. You can decide. We can all decide. The question is, are we willing to give up the story? That's kind of all it comes down to. But it can take a lot to be willing to give up the story.
So true. As you say that, I'm like, I think we may like, that's such a perfect kind of wrap up. Are you willing to give up the story? And we could also have like 8 episodes about that because it's such a good one. But I would love to know how people could work with you currently, if they can, and how to find you.
Yeah, they absolutely can. So I'm on the pathway of rebuilding the website because I've just relocated from having a physical studio where I did a lot of this work in Bristol. So that's in process at the moment. In the meantime, they can catch me by email. So I'll make sure that you have the details for that. I'm on Instagram as _mindbodycoach. And I release a fair amount of free content there. And yeah, the way that I tend to work is I do a lot of one-to-one support, whether it's in the mind or in the body or in a combination of the two. It's usually the combination that's the most effective. I do a lot of that on Zoom because I've got clients all over the world, which is amazing, constantly juggling the time zones. And anywhere that people feel that I could be useful, I'm really happy to be. I also do group retreats. I speak on topics like addiction. So yeah, really happy to be reached out to. Essentially, any way that I can support anyone that's currently struggling, that's going to be my jam.
Thank you. I will be sure to link all of that in the show notes, and I can't wait to have you back on the show to talk more. It was such a fun, interesting conversation.
I am so grateful to be here. It's a really wonderful wrap up to my day, to my evening. And I'm so excited about what you're putting out. Honestly, we've met such incredible, inspiring women on the course of this journey, and yeah, I'm really, really looking forward to hearing more from you. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Yes, thank you. Talk to you soon.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you learned something new and embrace being the student of your own life until the time we meet again. If you'd like a way to support the show and to hear more of this content, it means so much to me for you to take a few minutes out of your day to leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'd love to stay connected with you on Instagram or TikTok at Adriana Goes Creative. You can find me and hit follow while you're feeling inspired right after listening to the show. I can't wait to get a DM from you hearing what you loved about it and what you desire to hear more of. I appreciate each and every one of you so much. I'll talk to you soon. This podcast is for entertainment and general informational purposes only. I am not a licensed healthcare professional, and this podcast is not intended as a substitute for the advice of a physician or other qualified professional.